Welcome to the Binge Thinker podcast.
I'm Jay.
And I'm Sam.
The two of us enjoy meeting up to discuss the things that interest us.
We'll be focusing on topics concerning science, philosophy, culture and politics.
And we hope you find this discussion as interesting as we did.
In this episode, we talk about the ethics of research.
We briefly discuss unethical research before diving into stem cells, animal research and informed consent.
Okay, so I think an important point to bring up at the beginning of this conversation is how much things have changed over the years. So you've got a rich history of experiments that really could not be carried out today for ethical reasons. And I think it's fascinating what they were able to get away with.
Yeah.
And obviously, you know, what's equally as fascinating are the guidelines that have been brought in various disciplines to avoid horrible things happening again.
And obviously there's an argument to be made that without those original horrific, now looking back, horrific studies, we possibly wouldn't have ended up with the guidelines we have now anyway. It's like, kind of, maybe you have to overstep the line before we know where to draw the line on ethics.
I mean, that's super interesting as well, because some information that we have in... You know, psychology is something that me and you are very interested in, so we'll talk quite a lot about that. But for some of the information we have in psychology, these experiments that were done historically are the only examples of experiments that we have to draw on, simply because they could never be done again.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, ones that come to mind are like the Stanford prison experiment. It's a classic. You know, if you ever studied psychology, you'll know all about that.
Psychology of evil.
But the fact that they could, I mean, I suppose they probably didn't. At its conception, when planning the research, they probably didn't realize just how crazy it would end up getting. Like, if I remember rightly, like, people were barricading themselves in cells and. Yeah. I think a couple of them went on hunger strike.
Should we maybe say what the if we're going to talk about that one? Should we?
It's worth talking about.
Yeah, so the Stanford prison experiment was essentially into, it was looking at authority, wasn't it? Really,
I think it was about authority, but I think it was about how the circumstances can make you act in ways that are.
Incongruent to how you would usually normally act.
Yeah, exactly. And given the role of having any sort of authority can be corrupted, and I think it demonstrates that. But do you want to maybe briefly say what happened? So basically, Stanford prison experiment. The idea was that they recruited participants to take part in a false prison that was staged, I think, underneath Stanford University in the US, in a room underground. And they made fake cells, and they had a group of, I want to say 12 people, but that could be wrong.
It was a small group.
It was quite a small group, and they randomly assigned each of these 12 people into equal sets of either prisoners or guards. And quite amazingly, that the extent they went to make it realistic, like they actually for the prisoners, I think they actually got a police car and showed up at their house and arrested them.
Yeah, they really roleplayed.
They really went to roleplay in extreme detail, and they threw them in the cells. I think they even stripped them down, and the participants. So none of these people knew each other. Bearing in mind, they were given the authority to rule over these prisoners and punish them if they misbehaved as they see fit.
So all that was obviously kind of the setup, and so that was all scripted. That's what they were supposed to do to get into the role. Mm-hmm. But then the interesting point that comes from the experiment, obviously, is what they did afterwards, when they really started to settle into the roles, and the guards started giving really cruel punishments for very minor infractions and things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way you could describe it would be, it was like creatively evil. So some of the ways that and I mean, the whole point of it was that, I mean, as an interesting, if you were to write about it and try and pull together what you would take from it, is that a normal person, quote unquote, just an average student of a university, well-educated sort of person, can turn into a horrific monster, somebody who will go out of their way to cause somebody else harm.
Yeah.
And the whole, drawing it back into the point of the podcast, is that it's obviously unethical what happened. I mean, the more you look up about this, the better. There's all sorts of. It's a well-known psychology experiment. But the bottom line is it went pretty badly wrong. I think it had to be disbanded after something like 6 days.
Yeah, so I mean, it got to the point where some of the people who were playing prisoners were begging to be let out, and the guards were hiding
they were, like,
that
shouting.
information.
Yeah,
and I mean, there's been serious debate about it afterwards, but the fact of the matter is, as you were saying, it's obviously the actual procedure and what happened was massively unethical. But as what this podcast is kind of semi about, is the findings we got from it were really, really interesting, because it supported, like, another example is Milgram Study, which quite a lot of people probably already know about.
Yeah, this is like the classic psychology. Yeah. If you ever even heard the word psychology, you've probably heard of Milgram.
Essentially zapping people because you were told to, and it's all fine.
Yeah, that's all about obedience to authority.
Yeah, I think they do have a bit of overlap, though. I mean, that one wasn't explicitly about evil, but you have the same inferences. And
yeah,
the average person becoming.
In terms of what you can take from those experiments, there's quite a lot of the same kind of findings. But yeah, like bringing it into the staying on topic really is that these experiments, as interesting as they are, and as fascinating as they have been, and I mean they are some of the central points in the psychology A-level class. So it shows you how influential they have been historically. But yeah, there's no way you could do it the same way as you could now. I think people would be with the shock experiment. If you convince somebody that they're shocking somebody to the point of harming them, certainly nowadays, I mean that you would be causing somebody a lot of distress for doing that. So you wouldn't be able to do that. The prison experiment, the fact that people were humiliated, badly humiliated, and locked in solitary confinement. I mean, I think some people were really badly affected by it.
Oh yeah, there's people going to counselling and stuff afterwards. But I think the point we wanted to go on to make is it's not just that if you were, say, you're a social researcher doing psychology, working in that kind of field, it's not that you would do a similar piece of research and get in trouble for it. You wouldn't even be allowed to do it. When you apply to do a project, you have to go through multiple ethics boards and check everything's okay. There's a code of ethics nowadays.
That, right?
Exactly. If you suggested anything,
it'd be shot down. It'd be shot down initially.
Like, no, of course not. You absolutely cannot do that.
So driving forward with ethics of research, like, we can see historically that there's been all sorts of horrible things to do. We could literally spend an hour sat here talking about different examples of historical experiments that were ethically questionable at best and just downright evil at worst. I mean, really messed up stuff. And as much as we like to say it was good that we got that information, it is still a good thing that we have marched towards a fairer way of experimenting against people nowadays.
Just before we move on, like, sort of dive really deep into it, but I think it's interesting to say that we both actually have experience of this in a way, because our dissertation studies were both related with stress.
Oh yeah, the Trier
social stress test, and we both used it in our studies. I was actually in Sam's study in this test, and we won't go into the details of it because it'll take a long time to explain, but it's essentially a mechanism to make you feel lots of stress, so you can test how performance is changed by the stress.
Yeah, if you could imagine,
terrifying.
If you could imagine where the point of the experiment is to make somebody feel deeply uncomfortable and put them in it's actually fascinating in terms of, like, it's ethical. It's amazing that it's allowed, because the test is designed specifically with on established research, using principles to make people feel
But the critical point is it's a well understood, rigorous procedure that doesn't really have any long term effects.
No,
necessarily.
Plus, you should be allowed to study stress. It's not totally life changing.
No. So that's probably a point to wrap up on that bit. There is certain things that might seem a bit dodgy at first, but if you follow the right procedure, generally they'll be okay, depending on what you try to do to the person. But.
So kind of bringing that forward into the modern day, we come from all those examples of horrible experiments, and now things are very different. Just to use psychology, because we have been so far, there's a set of ethical principles inside. Well, it's the APA, the American Psychological Association. they developed a set of guidelines to avoid these horrible things happening again, basically. And that's the kind of set of guiding principles that are used today, and they stop these horrible things from happening. Which you've got to say it's a good thing, really, even if it stops you from being.
100%. I mean, there is nothing stopping someone in their own basement putting an ad out on Craigslist and doing a really unethical study. But the general practice is, if you haven't gone through an APA,
it probably wouldn't be recognised.
Well, that's the point I'm going to say. Even if you were to do that, you find amazing results, it's quite unlikely you get published. But that brings us on to interesting debates now. Then. So if just to get it started, then let's imagine someone was doing such a study. They privately, outside of a university or any kind of research body, they gathered a sample of 100 people, took them back to his house, into his basement, did a really messed up study, but found out something, don't know what, some amazingly critical finding that has huge implications for psychology. What do we do there?
Okay, right.
Because we found something, but they've broken all the rules along the way.
This is a really good question. I think that if it was up to me to go forward with this finding, let's imagine that this finding is really, I can't think of a perfect example, but it's something that upends a lot of established research by psychology. I would, obviously you can't redo that. If you're saying that the example of the thing that the guy has done is unethical, then what I would do is I would create research that tested the assumptions of that research that was ethical.
So I think that would generally be like what people might think as the way to take it forward. But there's a point to make that by doing that, you kind of, even though the person isn't necessarily benefiting financially, or, I mean, obviously he's getting some notoriety, but he's not really becoming famous in academic circumstances for any real good reason. But there is a risk of gratifying that kind of behaviour and saying, well, I mean, the ends kind of justify the means.
I see what you mean.
We're not going to accept it in mainstream society, but we are going to recognise your ideas and then test it later on in a better way. I think that's the thing you have to be very careful.
I think it depends how important. I know what you mean. So you don't want to set the example. You don't want to set the precedent that it's anybody okay. That what you're doing is okay and that you can get published this way.
But I don't think there's any way around it, really. I don't think there's any soft line on that. I think it has to be a hard line fact. Like, you have to follow the ethical principles, or we're not going to acknowledge anything. You couldn't, like, if this person found something that was, especially if the research had never been done before. Well, yeah, I guess and it depends on the implications as well. If we are saying it's a real world-changing...
Yeah, if it's something... you couldn't possibly expect psychologists to ignore it. Yeah. You just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But you're right, it would send the wrong message. There has to be agreement on the ethical principles.
But there isn't really a way around it, is there, I guess? If it's... And we kind of don't want to block the research as well. If it is so that's another idea. Slightly aside, imagine this really unethical study like we've just outlined, but the implications aren't negative implications. Actually, it's a world of good. Let's take a crazy example. It's like as a doctor working, he's been kicked out of hospitals. He's not allowed to work and practice as a doctor. Kidnaps some people who have cancer. Finds the cure for cancer. I mean, that's a good one, I think, because, I mean, there is no way we're throwing his research away. We are keeping his research. We'll probably never make statues of the guy.
I think you have to... I think you would have to be crazy to throw away the research.
Of course,
I think it almost doesn't matter how something as important as that. It doesn't really matter how it came about. It would be.
Well, I don't think we'll remember in 1,000 years anyway. We'll just remember we have the cure for cancer. We wouldn't really care about that.
I don't think you would be so hardline with any ethical principles. Like it's the APA guidelines in psychology, and there's other examples in different disciplines. You're not telling me that you would be so hardline with the principles of the ethical principles in that discipline that you would actually. You would actually discount that research as being noteworthy simply because it doesn't fit with the ethical guidelines.
I think if we were being pragmatic, what would probably happen is the person faces a hefty fine or jail sentence, but we do take the research.
Yeah. In fact, that's another element of it. Like, I don't necessarily want to dive into this particular idea too much, but I suppose ethics of research is a nice broad umbrella, and under that fits something that we haven't even thought about, or I haven't even thought about yet, which is the ethics of like using other people's ideas. Like, have you ever heard the idea that as you're going, let's say you wanted to become an academic, then as you're going up through the system of becoming an academic and getting to a position where you've got your own kind of lab and that kind of stuff, when you're doing the legwork, or say you're doing a master's or you're doing the early years of your PhD or something like that, I've heard it said, like when I was at York, I heard it said that it's quite common for your supervisor
to steal your idea.
To steal your idea.
Yeah, so you're going through and disseminate this idea to people you're looking for advice from. But because they're...
So you're this bright young student, this kind of enthusiastic guy who's come up with this great idea, this new way of looking at things that no one's really thought of before, and you put it to your supervisor, you put it to your PhD supervisor,
and he's like, "No, that's a terrible idea. Never think of that. Quick, get the press."
Exactly. Yeah. Like I'm gonna do an experiment on that.
Yeah.
Apparently, that's absolutely commonplace.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. I mean, and to be fair, not to be fair. This is very devil's advocate, not fair at all. But they are in a better place to run with it at the time. But I don't know. I mean, maybe we're definitely going to end up on a tangent. So we should cut this off at some point.
While I remember something, it is above board, because it is strictly the case that until you're a published researcher, I believe anything that you do is anything that you put forward as your work is actually intellectual property of the university.
I was literally going to say intellectual. Does it work like intellectual property?
It does, but while you're a student at a university, the work you do is intellectual property of the university.
Well, we know in all the studies and stuff we've done, it's even though it's got our name on it, we are kind of like a second person. Like our supervisor or academic tutor is the person.
Oh yeah, if you came across something really interesting, something that really made people look up.
Yeah.
Your supervisor would be the one that published it and got the credit, no doubt. So you might be named if you're lucky.
Well, I mean, hopefully you would be. We'll see. I think that would be grounds for debate. So, do we want to talk about then how the ethics is maybe changing?
Go on.
So I mean, one of the things I was thinking about for a while ago was I was reading a bit into Greek history and I always get the names of the three main Greek guys always really confused in my head. But all through the Middle Ages, let's just jump to the Middle Ages. It was we had the ideas of the humours. That was how the human body works and stuff. And one of the theories I've heard of why it took us so long to embrace some of the medicinal practices that were being practiced in other parts of the world is because the human body was seen as this sacred taboo thing. You're not allowed to root around inside and investigate.
And that's when
it's a sacred
so you're
thing.
Talking about ethics of research under religion, essentially.
I want to focus on just history. I don't want to get into religion.
No, but I'm just saying. I'm just pointing out that if you had to point to a cause of why ethics took the form they did at that time, it was probably because of the religious.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, so I find that really interesting because, I mean, obviously once we've started delving into the body, we found out a load of interesting processes and then came up with some interesting ideas like Descartes, thinking about how the brain works, you're thinking it was all a system of hydraulics operating things. So that was all really, really, really interesting. And I think there are still some of these taboos nowadays about some of the things you can and can't do with human bodies before and after death, and especially like organ. I didn't realise until a couple of days ago, watching a couple of documentaries and stuff. So in some places, organ transplants, like you cannot do organ transplants at all. Like obviously research as well, but just generally messing around with a dead person's organs, putting them into someone else's body, or like that seems crazy to me.
I mean, it's important to point out at this point that you're framing this as a historical thing, but like you just kind of you'd made the point. It is historical, yes, but it's also the case now. Like you say, depending on what, some people would feel that organ transplants or messing around with the human body, especially for something as apparently flippant as research. You know what I mean? It's
I think it's definitely the case that more in that
It's
group of people that were a bit
essentially.
against it, there would be more people that were up for organ transplants rather than just, oh, can we borrow your liver and just like do some experiments, see what happens when we pour formaldehyde on these certain parts of the body.
But I suppose things are different now because we're a lot more secular, generally speaking.
So right, bringing it back to research, the way I wanted to eventually go with that, if we want to touch it, is stem cell research.
Stem cell research,
That's an ethical minefield at the moment. That has this. I mean, it's almost an analogy to the analogy I said earlier about the man doing the dodgy experiments in his basement. There are a lot of people who you cannot mess with embryos whatsoever as stem cells. But let's say maybe not even hypothetically, theoretically, we may find cures for a myriad of diseases and ailments through stem cells. It's like finding a whole class of drugs that we didn't realise existed until about, I don't know, it's probably about 60 years or so.
And you can, and as well as as well as talking about any sort of disease, if for whatever reason somebody has damaged a part of their body, or if a part of the body becomes so badly damaged that it needs to be replaced, then it's my understanding that stem cell research could lead to the growing of new organs.
Yeah, exactly. So for skin grafts and stuff, I mean, skin's quite a complex organ, but it's possibly one of the simpler ones to grow from stem cells. Like making something like a kidney is it's got loads of tubules and lots of things going on, and I don't know. It seems a bit naive to kind of shut off all. Well, it's not necessarily naive though, because it comes down to a moral principle, doesn't it? If we're talking about embryos and stem cells,
it's about we're coming back to religion again as one of the reasons why you might not want. I mean, here's a bit of a challenge for you. Can you think of a reason why you shouldn't use stem cells that doesn't require you to fall back on religion as the reason?
Yes, because embryos and stem cells develop into children. That doesn't have to be a religious issue. It often is, but it could be from a humanist perspective.
Yeah, but isn't the whole point about that, like, the determining factor is when you believe that bundle of cells becomes a human being.
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily have to be a religious thing. The religious thing would be more about the spark of life rather than just us defining where consciousness is. True.
But we can both agree that it's arbitrary, regardless on whatever system you use. If it's religious and you say that the humanity begins, the life begins at conception. That's, in my opinion, arbitrary.
I mean, yeah, exactly. You could say it's before then if you wanted to. I mean, the sperm and the eggs are living things. They're not necessarily conscious.
Or you could say that it becomes it becomes a human, or should be considered as such, when it could live on its own, which is a certain number of months. I'm no expert in this, but I think the point is that this is a really a complex ethical issue, simply because I feel like any position that you care to take on it is going to be arbitrary, and that's why there's so many debates.
No, 100%. Yeah. It's a very fertile grounds for discussion. But slight segue from this, it's still fairly related. So we briefly said it was maybe to do with the consciousness. When the level of consciousness a thing has, when's it ethical to draw the line there? So we can make a parallel then to animal research through that. Which animals are okay to experiment on? Are there any animals
this is a great
bonobos and things with near human levels of intelligence, or can we not go any further than like minnows and rats and things?
I mean, I'm pretty sure rats are routinely used for medical research.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
So you've got two questions that are worth addressing. One of them is, which animals should you use, and also what potential benefits are so great that you can justify this research on animals. I think pretty much everybody would, if you're not a psychopath, pretty much everybody would agree that you should try and minimize suffering if you can. But so you wouldn't want to intentionally cause harm to an animal.
Let's hope so.
This is the thing. Like, it wouldn't. It doesn't even have to be evil. It could just be guided by the fact that you don't feel animals have the same level of like sentience, or don't have the same capacity for suffering as humans do.
Yeah, there's definitely an argument to make that a human life is worth multiple of a quote unquote lesser.
I mean that's an interesting topic all by itself. Actually, why do we tend to value human life, and is it arbitrary? Is it arbitrary? Of course,
we can go down some really existential like avenues of should we eat meat and stuff, but
that's the whole thing. So yeah,
should we tie it back
into keeping it focused? Yeah, like which animals are worth?
Right. So just to like lay some of this out a bit better. There are multiple animals that research is done on. There's and multiple purposes as well. So there's rats and bonobos. Let's take examples. We don't often test cosmetics on bonobos and things, but we do often test them on rats. But there are certain areas of research that testing on a rat doesn't necessarily give you any really interesting or particularly applicable data. Mm-hmm. We know this from psychology. A lot of neuroscience studies start in rats. There'll be someone's circadian rhythms, looking at their parts of the brain related to daylight and wakefulness and stuff. But there's only so far you can take that. Obviously, you can't go. Well, maybe you can go into some humans' heads and chop them up, and if they consent to it. But they're probably a bit crazy if they.
I still don't even think you could. I don't think you could do that.
Well,
because what would the incentive be?
Well, I mean, that was more of a throwaway. I wasn't actually suggesting that's a thing.
No, but I mean, we should, if we remember, come back to that.
But I think it'd be more interesting to talk about, as I keep saying, bonobos, because they are one of the bonobos and macaques, isn't it? The other primate we primarily focus on, and maybe chimpanzees as well.
Yeah.
With high level intelligence, are capable of learning some human language and interacting through sign language and things like that. I mean, there's arguments
mainly nouns, I think.
Right? Yeah, but I mean, they are at a level that they can communicate with us more than just a dog barking 3 different ways.
Yeah.
Like you can discuss ideas like Coco the gorilla, fantastic example.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You've got a balance. You've got a balance between how useful is the research that you can how applicable is the research to humans? Like you say, the closer you get in genetic similarity to humans, you could argue the more applicable, the more what's the word I'm looking for?
More transferable.
Transferable, yeah, it's more transferable. But of course, if you're looking at it from an ethical perspective, the closer you get to humans. In terms of genetic similarity,
the more damage you're potentially doing.
Well, the more
harm is possible to suffer.
The more ethically uneasy the idea becomes. I feel like, as you have to be matter of fact about this, but I don't think many people. A lot of people know that rodents are used for experiments.
Yeah, particularly pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, and you don't really see that much outrage about it. And you ask yourself, is this... I mean, yes, it's true that people would probably prefer... If they had the choice, they would prefer that no animal testing was done at all. But you don't see that much outrage.
So this relates onto something I wanted to go on to and talk about. Let's imagine a world where everyone is incited about animal research. Like, it just should not happen. There is no benefit to the animals, so let's just take this approach. Everyone's of this opinion. The only other two alternatives exist. Either we stop all kind of biological inference research,
which is a terrible idea.
Every subject that's tested on has to be a human volunteer.
Right, you see, you remember just a couple of minutes ago I actually said that we should come back to this, and now we're here again. So now there's ethical problems here as well. And so let's say we go down the path that it doesn't even have to be all or nothing. You can just ask the question generally: should it be okay for human research to be done if people consented to it?
Yeah, but I think that's pretty obvious. Yes.
No. But the thing is, I don't agree at all, because imagine if the incentive for somebody to take part in research is money, right? And
Yeah.
Then you would get a certain set of people that would do these experiments. Generally, people who are hard up for cash, people who didn't have much money. You have to worry whether or not people would put themselves at unnecessary risk just to get the money and put themselves through these horrific,
of course,
potential horrific damage.
You can imagine a situation in a fictional nation where you're allowed to sell organs. And you've got 2 kidneys. You're in a family that's broken down. Your house is destroyed. Whatever. You need some cash.
And you're a parent, and you need to.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, those people are more at risk. But the question we will go back to this very, very quickly. I just want to clarify the point I was making before wasn't saying that there can't be any ethical problems with it. I was just saying that, like, obviously, in a situation like that, experiment on humans can be fine. Not that
it can be fine.
Yeah. But now let's go back to
that. I just mean, imagine if it's a free-for-all and you go totally, like, down the path of liberty and you say, look...
Yeah.
It's assuming you do have some basic ethical guidelines, which is that the people have to be informed of the risks and they have to sign it. They can't be coerced and they can't be deceived into signing the papers to do the research. I still feel that that's ethically dodgy.
Yeah, it can be.
Because what's the motive? Like, you've got somebody who wants to take part in... They get paid quite a lot of money to have, shampoo squirted in their eyes or something, I don't know, whatever it is. That, yes, they are told that it could damage their eyesight, let's say. But surely there's an understanding that there's a high chance that it won't.
Yeah.
And if this person...
Yeah, it's essentially gambling, isn't it?
So this person comes in, signs all of the forms, gets spoken to for an hour, explaining what's going to happen. So you can definitely say they've got informed consent. This is a different universe to ours, by the way. And they take part in the experiment. They get the shampoo squirted in their eyes, and they go blind. Now, do you feel that it's ethically neutral that happened because they gave their consent? Because I still feel that there's something wrong with that. I feel like, yes, it's difficult because they're an agent.
In a universe where someone could give fully informed consent, which I don't think is ever true, because take for example the example you're suggesting, this squirting this dermatological agent in that has a chance of making them go blind. But in most of these studies, it's not that simple. It's not 99% of the time we expect it'll be fine. 1% of the time it'll go wrong in this very specific way. There are often side effects that no one anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, you could
build... So let's say this person, this 1 in 1%, gets psoriasis all over their body for the rest of their life. That wasn't a risk they even were aware of signing up to it. But it's a thing.
I suppose so, but you
probably wouldn't go that far.
You could put it in the papers saying, look, there's a potential for unseen circumstances.
Sure. But so to link this back then into what we actually do today in pharmaceuticals and stuff, that kind of agent probably wouldn't actually get that far in the first place, because there are a system in pharmaceutical research. It has to go through currently has to go through animal testing to a certain degree before it's even allowed to be opened up to volunteers for human research. So then, to bring it back to the question we were saying before, imagine this world where, well, not even imagine a new world, but imagine we campaign and animal testing is outright banned. Which is more ethical there? To expose humans, and you probably, as you said, possibly vulnerable people.
I think almost always.
A myriad of
that's
effects.
my position. I think almost you would find students that were hard up for cash. You would find people in the people who didn't have much money, who were in serious dire straits financially doing it.
I think it would take a very, very strong love of science for science's sake for a rich person to volunteer to be in a risky study.
Definitely, yeah. I don't think you would see it. I think it'd be very rare.
One in a million.
Just to address the point, like we should try and address the point you're making. I can understand where the ethical principles come from for the no animals position, because they don't have agency. They can't consent. They can't be informed. So whatever happens, regardless of the situation, when you test on animals, you're doing it without their consent.
Yeah, against their will.
You're doing it against their will, so you're forcing them into these situations. At least if you're testing humans, you can give them information and get their consent.
Say no.
They can say no at any point, and it's important to make sure that they do have the chance to say no and that they're doing it voluntarily. Yes, there's the caveat. Yes, there's the side bit that they might be doing it for bad reasons, for motivations, but they always have the opportunity to walk out the door, right? So arguably, when you look at it that way, which seems counterintuitive, doing these experiments, testing these products on humans, actually seems like the morally superior way of doing things, because you're not subjecting any living being to experimentation.
I was never thinking that was like a unknown fact. That was obviously always better.
I'm bringing it up because it seems counterintuitive, though, don't you think? Like, really,
I don't know. Right, so one of the we've introduced quite a few different problems in trying to decide who you should test on and when you should test on and what you should test on. I think the next thing is the balancing act between firstly, there's information that do we ever need to know it? Secondly, the second application of that is there information that of a certain grade that we should only test on humans rather than animals. For example, cosmetics. If you come up with a new cosmetics that makes your hair stand up really well, but we think there's a chance it might cause some skin irritation, is it ever ethical to test that on animals when it's not a life or death situation?
It's such a like indulgent reason to test animals, isn't it? It's so unnecessary. Like, you want to make sure that your hair is just that. I mean, we've already got loads of products that make your hair shiny.
Exactly. We're not going to die if we don't get this new product.
There's this product that people think they can make some money off that makes your hair that little bit shinier, right? And you're going to put animals in harm's way against their will, against their informed consent. For something that's really unnecessary. It's trivial. Trivial is the word. It's not even. It's not like it's a cancer drug. It's not like it's any kind of pharmacology. It's not like it's any kind of anything that's going to make a serious. It's just
not going to make a real impact in the world.
There's a serious discrepancy between the cost and the benefits.
So that's an interesting turn of phrase. Do you think it might be worth to discuss. I don't know actually. Do you think there's a dynamic here between ethics being traded off for commercial value? Because if we were to stick with the cosmetics example, as we've said, it's not going to save anyone's life, it's not going to cure anything. The only reason these potentially morally dubious practices are taking place is because someone is making more money by testing them on animals that you don't have to pay and only have to feed a medium amount, rather than on human people.
I think
you have to pay thousands of pounds for the trials.
I think you've either advertently or inadvertently happened upon the real reason why things are the way they are anyway. Like, the amount you have to pay humans, the amount of hours you have to put into briefing humans and going...
And then the follow-up after.
And then the follow-up, you've got to offer them support afterwards. There's ethical guidelines, not the APA ones, but in other disciplines, like you said, there will be strong, well-defined guidelines that have to be followed, that require man-hours, that have to be paid for. Yeah. They actually have to be paid for the study, the building, rental,
and
everything.
if anything unexpected happens 20 years down the line that's linked to that research, you may be liable to
liabilities, exactly, loads of that. So it would be naive to think that one of the reasons why we test on animals and not humans is because it's less expensive to do so.
So we don't have,
which is ethically, it's a nightmare, by the way.
Awful, yeah. we don't seem to have like massive insider knowledge on this, but we do have some understanding of how science is made, and it's funded, and quite often it's funded by organisations who have a particular interest, and it's usually not that much more than it costs to do the study. You're usually skimping to be able to get the study through. It's not like you have an idea and £10 million falls in your lap, and go off and do whatever you want. You have very constricted guidelines to follow. And I imagine, especially in pharmaceuticals and stuff, there's a lot of trying to trim the costs and get it down and down. Maybe a few meetings in boardrooms and this is running on for a bit too long. We've got to get you to human trials and still have 100k left over for that. So you're going to have to, I don't know. That's a big one. Maybe that's something that we could maybe do a whole podcast on later. The relationship between consumerism and science.
Ethics, morality is such a huge topic. You've got 100 different angles to come at it from, and we're just skimping over the surface of ethics of research at the moment. We definitely will be doing further conversations on ethics. There's so much. There's so much to talk about, really. So I think something I definitely wanted to talk about was ethical studies. Studies that have where the ethics are so questionable that they may never be carried out.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's
as in ideas we could come up with, but we know would be untested.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of bringing it back to the beginning of the podcast. You've got ideas that could be carried out because the ethical guidelines were looser back then,
or non-existent.
and if you carry that idea through, like what studies could have been done that didn't. Now that we have a better insight into the whole scientific model, pretty much concerning everything. What are some studies? What are some studies that you would love to know the answer to, but you could never do? So something that we brushed on before we started recording was the idea of looking at what happens in the brain at the moment of death. Oh, yeah. So as interesting as that would be, you hear people talking about people who have had near-death experiences. That's another topic that we can talk about. People who've had near-death experiences, they describe this really rich inner world and things that happen, and these are topics that people would love to know more about.
Yeah, a scientist hears that thing and go instantly, how?
And it's quite a common thing. It's quite common. Is it? I don't know what percent it is. I don't want to put out an incorrect statistic here.
Yeah, but we can maybe find it.
We'll look into it, like you say. Yeah. But it's common enough for it to be scientifically interesting, I think. But in terms of the ethics of it, you have to ask yourself, how many people would consent to living their very final moments inside an MRI machine surrounded by scientists and equipment? Like, is it really ethical to subject a human to that in some of the most vulnerable moments of their life? Like, as much as we love science, as much as we are passionate about science, is science the most important thing you could be doing in that person's last few moments?
I think it can be. I know, for example, if I was in a situation where that was a valid thing that could happen, I would definitely sign up to that study.
Yeah, but what about, I appreciate that, but what about if you were with your family? Would you not want to be with your family?
Yeah, but
with your children?
They could be there too.
They're stood in the control room?
Yeah, of course, yeah. They can chat with the scientists, it's fine. Right, so what as you said, we were talking about this just before we started the podcast. And one of the things I brought up was that this isn't necessarily unethical. If the person consents, it's absolutely fine. They will know. There's a distinction in this compared to the studies we started the podcast by talking about. In the studies with Milgram and Zimbardo, the people taking part didn't know what was going to happen fully. Or in the Milgram study, for example, they were deliberately deceived, so they couldn't give informed consent. In this particular example is different, in that if you're lying in your deathbed, you know you're going to die. That's not an unexpected thing. You know there's going to be a lot of scientists around with you, and you know you're going to be in an fMRI machine. It's probably going to be a bit of a weird way to go out, but if you're game for that, I don't see that as unethical at all.
Yeah, because you have, like you say, you have given consent,
and it would depend on the illness, and if you were allowed to. Obviously, you would have. We've done ethical approval forms and stuff, and one of the really big things you have to make sure the participant knows is at any point they can say, "No, I'm done. Get me out of this. I'm finished." So that would be a thing you would have to definitely reinforce to them over and over again. Like, if at any point you decide, this isn't how I want to spend my last moments, that's fine. Okay, it sucks, but we're gonna have to leave.
Get them out. And take them to their family.
That's the only bit for me that could be a bit ethically dodgy. Like, you've got to make sure that's respected. But as long as that is respected, I don't see a problem with that. I think that's fine.
I suppose, like you would say that the trouble with it then is not actually ethical.
It's more logistical.
I think the reason why it seems like ethically dodgy is, again, it's this kind of. I feel like that you can't help but have some of the ethical principles of the major kind of official religion of your country. I feel like at some level, even if it just comes through the language, there is like a residual ethical
Don't get me wrong. It feels
wrong.
But
this is what I'm getting.
But lots of things feel wrong or right, and then you analyse them and you realise actually it's just an instinctual feeling.
This is what I'm saying. The feeling is residual. It feels like a religious concern. It's like there's this. I think there's this idea that human life is not just important, not just worthwhile, not just valuable, but sacred.
Yeah.
And I think that comes through the language that we use. That comes through the cultural, like the residual cultural, because this country's been Christian for many years, decades, centuries even, and it feels like you've got this. It sits uneasy with you to think that you could. It's not. The weird thing is, though, it's almost as if I'm suggesting that science is not a good way to spend your last. I'm not suggesting that science is not a good way to use your last few hours.
But are you suggesting that it's quite likely most people would not see it as a good way to spend your last?
Exactly.
But that doesn't necessarily matter.
It's not very wholesome, isn't it? It's a bit faceless. It's not very warm. It's not very.
That's definitely your opinion on that, though.
Oh yeah, I'm prepared to.
So this is a thing that, again, we may be getting a bit too technical into how science works and stuff, but I'm sure most people understand that when you do a study, you take a sample of people. The people who weren't game with spending their last few minutes in a scientific study wouldn't even be involved in the study in the first place.
I trust me that is obviously that's something worth pointing out. I was playing devil's advocate in the sense that it's a fairly common position to take that life is sacred, and that would be, I don't know, quite a cold and unceremonial way to use your last.
Well, if I could just take myself as a personal example, then use myself as the person in this theoretical situation, I wouldn't. And we're getting off topic, but I think it's interesting, so let's talk about it. I don't think that would be a cold, impersonal way to spend your last few moments. I think that would be a way to immortalise your being forever in human.
I mean, it is inspirational, isn't it? It's like
you won't be remembered by name, but you will be contributing to a thing that will outlive you.
I suppose. That's fantastic. You're right. I mean, people. That is a good point. Yeah, that is a good point.
To me, that's almost a religious.
Like I say, I was just coming forward from the perspective of like the residual, how sacred human life is, but. You're absolutely right, because I think people spend a large chunk of their lives trying to feel like they are part of something bigger than themselves. Like that, I think that's an inherent human need, right? I mean, we can talk about the human condition in a separate podcast.
Oh, definitely.
That is something we should definitely talk about, by the way.
Expect a very rambling podcast for that one.
If you agree, and I think you can make a fairly strong case that being part of something bigger than yourself is important to human well-being. It's different for everyone, but that satisfies that criteria. If you've spent, in terms of being useful,
exactly.
How useful are most people's last few minutes?
Exactly.
Well, if you did a heroic act and died doing a heroic act, then chances are your last few minutes were very, very useful.
And to be fair as well, all you've done there is maintain some of the status quo. Whereas the universe is losing you, but you're actually giving something extra. So I don't know. I think that's a pretty noble goal.
I mean, we'll if there is such a study, then we will definitely have to link it. But I don't think that. I think the research into what happens at the point of death is pretty sparse. I don't know.
Yeah, that's definitely true. But so I was watching a program the other day. This maybe we're getting towards the rounding up bit, but this is very, very related to ethics and after death research. So there was lots of people have probably heard in passing the idea of a body farm. It sounds really morbid and like cultish or something at first, but it's not. It's essentially a scientific endeavour where people donate their bodies to a body farm, which is basically a research institute for crime that takes bodies and leaves them out in the wilderness and uses them as a way of researching how to accurately determine when and where and how someone died. So you go to these places and they're usually really, really well hidden, and you go through a padlocked door and stuff, and there are all these people who have said, once I'm gone, you can take me, put me in this place, and there'll be forensic people who test different methods. Like,
is it for education?
Well, it's partial. They use it for everything. It's like for education, but the program I was watching, it was based on crime. So they were doing things like testing liver temperature and stuff. But then they also look at decay and things to help try and track down missing people and stuff. And it's all very morbid.
Oh, is it for forensic science?
Yeah. It's all very morbid. But also, I mean, how fantastic is that? Like, I mean, you're gone and you're giving masses of research to all these people.
Useful data that
and it's completely ethical because you've said, I'm not... At the time you're going to be using my information, I'm not even going to be here anymore. So, I mean, to me, that sounds absolutely fantastic. That's a great idea.
So, yes, I've been drawing it together, as I feel that we should at this point. Like, it seems that the position you're taking generally, if I was to put it into a principle, is that most things are fair game if people can consent to them. I actually, if we're trying to kind of put us in positions how we stand on this, I'm a little bit more cautious, I think, because I feel like the reasons why you might want to do some of these things are unclear. But I generally, I'm pro freedom in that respect.
Well, I think that's actually what you just said is completely congruent with what you just described me as long as people can give informed consent.
Oh, but but that doesn't
without being manipulated.
And that they are free to make that choice.
Yeah, without it being detrimental to them to not take part in things.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a big topic. I think maybe this is something we should come back to this exact idea and just have a second part of the conversation at some point.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell by all the different paths that we have crossed but not gone down. There's so many different.
There's so much more to do.
I mean, I think even while doing research for this particular podcast, that there's areas that we wanted to talk about, but I mean, we would be here for a long time talking about it. But yeah, I mean, overall, you just in terms of the march forward of ethical principles, we're definitely in a better position now than we were. Yeah. And now that consent's important, we can have discussions about the types of research that are ethical to do. And
it's definitely a topic that's not going to go cold though. As we carry on and start finding new technologies and new ideas and things, I think there are definitely going to be new ethical principles that we've never encountered before and have no precedent for. We've not had the Milgram Study yet. And it'll be interesting to see how we, as a society, maybe even as a world, as a species, react to those
just on that point before we finish up, like, you, depending on your opinion of ethics and whether or not they exist as a standalone thing from humans, as something that exists outside of humans. I don't happen to think they do. I think that they are dynamic and changing. And for that reason, like you say, we're not talking about a stationary idea here. That this is dynamic and it's changing all the time. And it's not going to go cold.
And I'm sure, and then just in closing, I'm sure there's many things that we do as general practice now that we'll look on later in 1,000 years or so and look back and think that was so barbaric. How did we think that was okay?
Maybe even 50 years.
Yeah.
Or 100 years or so.
Yeah, maybe so. Anyway.
Yeah.
It was a really good one.
Yeah.
Really good talk.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider subscribing.
You can also follow us on Reddit and Twitter.
Thanks for listening.